The Caro-Kann is an opening with some extraordinary features. I will now list 5 of them. Feature 1. Overall quality. Caro-Kann is part of many 2,700 players' repertoire. Personally, I don't know any line which would give white a substantial advantage. This is really a tough nut to crack for the e4 player. Feature 2. Simplicity. The Caro-Kann stands on the solid ground of the classical chess principles. Black directly fights for the center by challenging white's e4 pawn. As a result, he creates enough space to develop his minor pieces in a straightforward manner. This also means that black is able to navigate by applying normal opening logic. Understanding typical pawn structures and recurring patterns is more important than learning long variations by heart. Feature 3. Robustness. Caro-Kann is what I call a default opening. You can play it when preparing for the game is impossible. There are hardly any lines that are so sharp that you need to bring your analysis into your short-term memory directly before the game. Feature 4. Versatility. Against any of white's options, you have the choice between several equivalent lines. This kind of flexibility is a hallmark of good openings. Feature 5. Winning potential. It is true, your winning potential is much smaller than in the Sicilian defense, but so is your risk. That said, your winning potential is higher compared to other solid openings such as the Petrov defense or the Queen's Gambit declined. The reason lies in the asymmetric pawn structures which will arise almost without exception. This leads to the kind of imbalances you need to play for the full point. Let's now continue with our game. d4, d5, knight c3. This is the main line. White can also play knight to d2. In both cases, you take on e4 and we will reach this position here. Of course, there are also other variations such as the Panov attack and the two knights variation, etc. But now I present you the main line. Why is the main line so important? If you learn a new opening, you typically start to learn the main line, because if there's something wrong, and this might be subjective, if there's something wrong with the main line, you don't need to learn any other lines. Imagine you start with the side lines, because maybe you have a book at hand which is structured in a way that it first presents the side lines. So you start with the side lines, and then when you come to the main line, you suddenly find out that what you see is not really what you want to have. The main lines normally are main lines for a reason, because they represent the strongest options of your opponent. So first tackle the main lines, and when this is good, you are on safe ground and can continue. So this is what we are doing. It's about the main line. Bishop f5. As I said, you have many options in good openings. Bishop f5 is called the Capablanca variation or the classical variation, but it is not the only move for black. Black can also play the move Karpov used to play quite often here, knight d7. I find it a bit passive, but it's not bad. And then knight f6 with the idea to recapture the e-pawn. This is quite topical, or has been quite topical the last, let's say, couple of years or within the last 10 years. Many top players have tried this with black, so that's a decent alternative. I personally don't like this variation so much because I'm really fond of pawn structures, pawn play, and I like to have healthy pawn structures. I don't like doubled pawns so much, but admittedly this is just a matter of taste. I love the positions which occur after the move bishop f5. Okay, the knight has to move away. Knight c5 is also possible. Fischer once played knight c5, but that's just a sideline. So knight g3 is what you will find when you play bishop f5 most of the time. Bishop g6, h4, that's the main line again. There are other lines, knight f3 or knight h3 or knight ge2, but h4 is the most principled move for white here. So the threat is h5, winning the bishop, so you have to create a flight square. Knight f3, and now white wants to, white wants to play his knight to e5, so h5 is not necessarily played the very next move. If you don't prevent knight to e5, let's say you play knight f6, then white might opt for this line. So I personally, I like to play knight e7 here, just preventing knight e5. What I want to do with black, I want to head straight for the main lines because I love them so much. Now white plays h5. There are also other moves, but this is by far the most popular one. Bishop h7. This pawn structure here is quite remarkable on the king side. This h-pawn can be good or bad. It can be strong, it can be weak. It really depends on the battle. It kind of squeezes black a bit on the king side, and it virtually makes a move like g6 later on impossible, because after hg6 you have to recapture the f-pawn, which would leave the e-pawn isolated and the square e6 soft. So white fixes the pawn structure here, which can be of importance in the endgame. But this pawn also can turn out to be weak. So white has to be careful now with his pawn. Bishop d3, the only move here, because the h7 bishop is so strong, you have to exchange it. Takes, e6. And here are two main lines. The old main line is bishop f4, but this is inferior to bishop d2, which was played in this game. Knight f6. Now we have the typical pawn structure here on the board, the Caro-Kann pawn structure. d4 versus c6, e6. This is a Caro-Kann center, but also with this peculiarity that the h5 pawn is exposed. Well, I will come to this in a bit. Castles. White castles queenside. Normally it is logical if you have pushed this pawn that far. You want the rook supporting it. So castling kingside, which is possible, is not that logical, right? And now comes an important move with black. Bishop e7. This is an important move. The whole variation is very old. I mean, the name Capablanca variation already gives that away, right? So it is very old, but it kind of came back to fashion in the 90s, and since then it is very popular amongst strong players. So what was different then? What happened in the 90s? It was when the line bishop e7 intending to castle kingside was revived. I think that line was played by Larsen already much earlier and by others as well, but it never really could substitute the old way. The old way of playing was queen c7 followed by queenside castling. Of course, that is very solid to castle the same way as white, but it's also relatively passive. There are some problems connected to that plan of castling queenside. But in this one game, I cannot go into too much detail. So what I can say is this bishop e7 move is very important if you want to play the Capablanca variation. Now, in our game here, white played a bad move, c4. As you see indicated here by the arrows, such are the main lines here. King b1 is the most frequent move, followed by knight e4 and queen e2. But in our game, the white player played c4. And actually this is a move which looks normal, but is bad, objectively bad. And as it looks normal, I can already tell you, if you play the Caro-Kann yourself one day, maybe inspired by this game, you will meet your opponents. I mean, it also depends on your level of play, of course, but you meet most likely opponents who play a move like c4. It is logical to grab space in the center. It is logical to deprive the knight of the square d5. So normal looking move, but bad. Why is this move bad? Actually, for a couple of reasons. First of all, it opens up the king side here. You see the king is now open. You want to have a safe king, and this damages king's safety for quite a bit. Secondly, the pawn c4 itself can become a target. Black will later play c6, c5, and then black has play in the c file against that c4 pawn. Now imagine black would have castled queenside, the king being on c8. In that case, it wouldn't be that easy for black to exploit this weakness on c4. So this gives you already an idea why castling kingside is potentially much more poisonous, for white, much more dangerous for white, because you are quite flexible with your queenside pawns. Also, what black could do now is to play b5. That's a good move. It's a sacrifice, a pawn sacrifice. But if white would accept that sacrifice, opening the b file, he would be in quite big danger of getting attacked and even checkmated in the course of the game. So first of all, you open up the king. Then after c5, this pawn is exposed on the c file, and then you give like a hook for black to open up the position with b5. So there's a lot of downside, connected to this move, but the average club player doesn't know it, and that's what makes this line so dangerous for white. Now, black played queen c7 here. I think b5 is the best, but queen c7 is also a decent move. Let's say that. Now, I use this game for private training, for one-on-one trainings. I have a lot of students who are learning the Caro-Kann with me, and if you see some errors here, mostly those errors, they result from my lessons. So what did I mean here with the green and yellow arrow? The knight g3 is another of white's problems in this Caro-Kann variation, because this knight is dominated by black's pawn here on e6. It cannot go to f5 under normal circumstances. There are some tactical variations where this can happen. For instance, if there's a rook on the e file and the bishop e7 is unprotected, then we have this move. We see this move happening, from time to time. But often it's not a problem for black, or black can also prevent that. Normally, this knight stands very badly on g3, and also because, this was a mouse slip. Let's go just back. Not only because it cannot move, it also hems the g-pawn. Remember, black is about to castle short side. So what white wants to do is to push the pawn to g5 to open up the king side. Because if white stays passive or idle on the king side, surely black will use his fluid pawn structure on the queen side to attack white's king. So this knight is in the way of the pawn. That is a problem. Now knight e4 happened, and the reason is that the knight wants to be exchanged by black's knight because it is just worth less than the knight f6 on a square such as g3, and also it wants now to liberate the g-pawn. Rook d8. The rook, of course, stands pretty well in that line opposite the queen. Of course, there's something going on, especially if black plays c5 later. So this square d3 normally is not the favorite square of the queen. That's why, remember, when I had this position here on the board, one of the arrows points to e2. So queen e2 is one of the three main lines. The queen e2 is the best square for the queen because the d file is a very, very dangerous place for the queen. From e2, also the queen would prepare knight e5. Let's say black's queen is on c7, then of course you would need to defend that knight one more time. Okay, let's go back to our game. After rook d8, now white played a normal looking move, but it is actually also bad. Like c4 has been bad. It is a bad move. Better would have been knight takes f6, knight takes f6, queen e2 with an equal position. Okay, queen b1, and now black castles king side. So now a couple of colors here. Let's just clean the board. This is a position I can use now to explain once more the motivation to play this line against the main line of the Caro-Kann. So to play this line with black against knight c3 on move 3, or to play the Caro-Kann in the first place. This position is extremely interesting, extremely deep, because you have this typical structure, which is d4 versus e6, c6. But in contrast to other lines, other openings with the structure, and well, I just show you what I mean. Imagine here in this position, white would not play h4. White would play quite timidly knight f3, knight d7, and then let's say bishop e2, e6 castles. And here black will also castle kingside. So again, here we would have the same center, d4 against e6, c6, but this position would be much more shallow compared to our line, simply because it is just about this center formation. This position would be much more drawish, but if you play a weaker opponent, you can still win this one here. If you later play c5, accomplishing different, or let's say opposed majorities, white would have his 3 versus 2 majority on the queen side, and you have a 4 versus 3 on the king side. You might get a minority attack going Well, I analyzed that and I found some interesting winning ideas for black. But the drawishness is much bigger in this position compared to our position of the game. Now let's go back to the game. So we have the same central structure, but we have two additional dimensions. Dimension one are the kings which have castled into the opposite direction. So now we have the notion of attack and defense going on. Black can be attacked on the king side theoretically and white on the queen side. So this is a complete new dimension. And another new dimension is this pawn on h5, which very often constitutes a liability for white, because you see now the rook is defending the pawn, but what if the d-file opens and the rook h1 is needed in the d-file? Let's say black takes on d1 and the rook would love to recapture but cannot because it has to play babysitter for the h5 pawn. So these additional dimensions make this position extremely difficult for white. Why do I say white? Of course also for black, but if I say white, I have two good reasons for stressing the white player. Reason number one. First of all, we are here playing our pet line with black. So we are on our home turf. This is always the case. Black normally has a home game because he's the expert. If you play e4, you have to learn so many openings. You can potentially play against, and black can concentrate on, let's say, studying the Caro-Kann or the French or the Sicilian. He is a home player. White normally has some opening advantage, and originating, from his first move advantage. This is what white's advantage is, but black has normally the better knowledge. Okay, so you have been studying this position, so this complexity is not a problem for you. But for white, who maybe didn't go into detail when looking at this line. And secondly, this multi-dimensional position, with so many interesting facets, makes it very difficult for white, to orientate. Black actually has a static advantage in the position you see on the board, because black has no weaknesses. You see black's pawn structure completely compact, no weaknesses at all, while white has this doomed h-pawn. This pawn on h5 very often is lost in the course of the game. In many Caro-Kann games, this is what happens. Also in this one, by the way. So white now has a static disadvantage. Let's just clean up again. White has a lot of weaknesses here. First of all, his king is a bit weaker than black's king, because he played c4. Then we have the main weakness, the pawn h5, but then we have other weaknesses as well. The c4 pawn is weak, as you will see, but then we also have these two pawns which can also become weak because they lack king's protection. Many of you will hear this concept now for the first time, and it's one I actually came up with by myself. I didn't read it anywhere. So you see, black's king here gives protection to these pawns here. If you would castle queenside, then the f7 pawn would be weak in case white plays knight e5 and then threatens to take on f7, with the king here on c8. Also, let's say there's a bishop on c3. The bishop is looking to the pawn g7, which might be unprotected with the king on the queen side. So you see here some additional reasons why to castle kingside with black. But now white's pawns, they don't have this king's protection. Of course there are pieces that can take care of these pawns, but they already have to take care of other pawns as well, right? Everything which is encircled red. And that is a problem. Every weakness is one weakness too much, because it binds pieces. Pieces want to be free, they want to be active, they want to have a free radius, but once they are tied to the defense of pawns, they are worse off and they have to be devaluated actually. So now you have all these weaknesses. White has a lot of liabilities here, we can state. So white has a long-term problem and black has the better long-term prospects here. White might come up with some attacks, so white has a bit more space right now, and white also sometimes can create some activity on the king side. Here not anymore because white made some mistakes already. It's too late for that. So the bottom line is that white's position is overstretched. White's position is overstretched. You find this in warfare also. Many battles or wars have been lost because one side was too greedy, expanded too far, and could not administer or defend all that conquered space. White just grabbed too much space, more than he can take or he can administer. Now let's move on with the game. This position is already slightly better for black actually, and that is an important aspect, because if you would just take a guy from the street and ask him to come to the board and evaluate this position, he would maybe say that white is better because of the looks of the position. White has more space here. It looks that white has some advantage. Maybe he is a bit knowledgeable of chess, and then he will find out that white has some obligations here, some weaknesses. Maybe he would say equality. But in reality, black already has a slight advantage. And now after g3, which is a normal move in the main line, where, or let's say in the line with the king on c8, there you play g3 intending bishop f4, right? So this is also a normal looking move, but a bad one. And now black plays c5, and guess what? What would you call this position here? How would you estimate this position? Think a bit. Is black slightly better? Well, I already gave it away, right? That it's not equal. So is black slightly better here? Well, that would be the wrong answer. Black actually is clearly better here. Clearly better, minus plus. And that's really something that happened to me so often when analyzing the Caro-Kann, that I stumbled over positions where the engine was more optimistic than I. But that was just because I, at that point in time, lacked understanding of the position. Now I know better. Black's advantage comes well camouflaged. It comes under the radar. And that is what makes this line extraordinarily dangerous for white. Because the best kind of advantage is the one that goes unnoticed by your opponent. So if your opponent still thinks that everything is hunky-dory, this is the most dangerous situation he can be in. Okay, black is clearly better, and the reasons are encircled here in red and yellow. White's position is overstretched. White has a bit of an unsafe king and has well, let's take this one away here, because this d4 pawn is going to be exchanged. But white has three severe weaknesses, as we will see. Now, knight f6 was not the best move. Bishop but let's not go too much into detail, right? You can check this game with your own engine, and you will come to the result that your engine will give a clear advantage for black. You can check it yourself. Knight f6, bishop c3, also a normal looking move, right? A normal looking move. White plays only normal looking moves, but white is clearly worse here. Bishop c5 important because this d4 bishop is very strong. That bishop has to be exchanged, and after all these exchanges, what remains will be white's weak pawns, as you will see. White now already committed the losing error. So after white's next move, he is losing. The best move here is queen to e2. In the game, white played queen c2. So I think the best way to go about is first to show you the game, and then we can return to this position and check what would have been the result after queen e2. Let's first show you why queen c2 is a mistake, one more mistake. And if you are honest to yourself, and I mean, given that you have no specific knowledge of this variation, you could not really, you would not really be able to attach any question mark maybe to white's moves, because all of white's moves so far have been quite normal. But making normal non-script moves is simply not enough in this strategically very demanding line of the Caro-Kann. So queen c2 question mark, and now black is winning a pawn. This queen here on c7, here this c7 queen is such a monster in this line, because it can go anywhere. You know, in this game we will learn about the motive queen c5, which is a very important motive. In other variations, the queen goes to b6, attacking d4 and b2 or f2. In other variations, of course, without a knight on d4, the queen goes to c6, maybe attacking a hanging knight on f3 or a hanging pawn on g2. And then with the pawn here on g2, the queen sometimes goes to f4, and from there it is like a whirlwind, attacking all of white's weak pawns directly or indirectly. So now c5 is a square. From there the queen attacks 4 soft spots at the same time, as you can see. At first the knight has to move away, but if it does, problems follow. Knight b3 was the game. Let's see what happens after knight f3. Now we take on d1, and of course the queen cannot take. Not only is the c4 pawn now gone, if black so desires, also the f2 pawn. I told you the c4 pawn would be weak after the move c6, c5. This is a good example. But here queen f2 would be the stronger move. If this would unroot also the g3 pawn, so white would be completely lost here. Okay, after rook d1, the best move is rook d1, but now queen takes h5. I told you the h5 pawn very often is doomed in our line. Here it falls. So this was the line knight to f3. In the game, there happened knight to b3. Attacking the queen. Now we take, and of course the queen cannot recapture because again, queen takes f2, game over. After rook takes d1, black just took the h-pawn. It was for the taking. This pawn just, as it happened in this game here, ventured just too far down the board and on h5. It was disconnected with the g-pawn and now dropped off finally. I show you the rest of the game. It's over very, very soon, and you know what is telling is that also the c4 pawn is going to fall here by some small tactics, yeah, but it is telling. Knight c1, rook c8, and now another blunder came, knight to d3, and now we could play here with black rook c4. Well, if I say we, you can see I sympathize a lot with with the black player here. Well, I play the line myself. I love the line, so that's why I said we. Rook c4, the queen is overloaded. The game ended like this: queen takes c4, queen d1, knight c1. And black could simply exchange queens, as now the knight ending is completely lost. The most easy way here is just to push the h-pawn, right? Also, there's some problems with these 2 pawns here. So black won this game as white resigned here on move 30. Let's go back to the position after bishop c5, queen c2, lost the pawn, queen e2 would have been better, but even here white is in all kinds of troubles. So bishop d4, knight d4, and here you have 2 moves, queen c5 or rook c8, both is good. Queen c5, again, this multiple attack of the queen. This queen is a real monster, as it is always the case in positions where one side has a lot of weak spots. The queen loves weaknesses in the opponent's camp. Knight c2, so that's the difference. The knight can now go to c2, and the queen from e2 can kind of protects all the weak pawns, so also the h5 pawn. Now rook d1, of course rook d1, and now yes, black can take the pawn, and it's not bad to take the pawn on h5, but he has also an alternative. First, let's see what happens. So the difference now is that white takes. You know, in the line before, the queen was on c2 and not on e2. Now the queen can take, knight takes, and the rook can penetrate black's 7th rank. That is the difference. But no problem for black, no big problem, I would say. We defend the pawn, knight b4, the knight returns, and the rook has to stay, of course, on the 7th rank in order to show some kind of compensation for the minus pawn. But now black attacks white's kingside pawns, the knight defends, and now we play h5, king c2, g5, and black is able to create an outside pass pawn by pushing h5, h4. So also in this position with the rook being passive, let's say temporarily passive on b8, while black has an extra pawn and potential to push his h-pawn with a clear advantage. Here after rook takes d1, there's an alternative also, rook c8. So if black does not want to allow white's rook to d7, he can play rook c8, rook d4, defending the pawn, and now a5. This is also a clearly better position for black. White has this problem with the h-pawn, the c-pawn is weak, and the white's king is weaker than black's. Black has a solid defense, 4 pawns. This king here is a bit open, the first rank is a bit soft, and yeah, depending on how it goes, you know, now the knight is on c2, which is a passive square, but if the knight wouldn't be there, black might push his pawn to h3. There are a lot of ideas here for black, so the engine also attaches a clear advantage to black's position. Then after knight takes d4 instead of queen c5, there's also rook c8, another way to get a clear advantage for black. Let's say rook c1. I mentioned this pawn is a weakness. You know, when white played c4, I mentioned this pawn was a weakness. Now it has to be defended. And now look what happens. The other rook now moves to d8. Let's play it again in slow motion. So the queen's rook was on d8. And now you see a typical maneuver. The d8 rook goes to c8, making space for the king's rook on d8. So rook c1, now the king's rook comes. Now the problem is that white cannot copy black. White cannot do the same. If rook h d1, we have queen c5, and you see the h5 pawn will drop off again. And that is also one major motive, for black to exploit the rook on h1 being bound to the defense of the pawn. He just switches the battle to 2 lines, shifting it to the c file, occupying the queen's rook, then occupying the d file with the other rook, and white's king's rook cannot follow suit. So now rook h4 is forced, protecting the knight from the side, but now the rooks are not connected. There's a problem on the first rank, and black is clearly better. For instance, could he play rook d5? Yeah, the c1 rook is now without protection, potentially attacking the h5 pawn. Let's say a3, making some air for the king on a2, and now rook e5, pushing the queen, and now queen b6. And now, as the queen here is also putting pressure on the knight, the next move might be rook takes h5, rook h5, knight takes h5, queen takes h5, and then finally queen takes d4. So we see white has a lot of soft spots here. Also the f2 pawn, in some variations later down the road. Black again has a clear advantage, as white has all the weaknesses and black has all the active pieces. I hope you liked that game. I hope that you might feel inspired by it. Maybe you will now have a look into the Caro-Kann. If you want to learn it in depth, you can go to my website and contact me. Then we might arrange for one-on-one meetings on the Caro-Kann. In any case, I wish you a lot of luck with your personal Caro-Kann.